My name is David Keller. Thanks for tuning in to an episode of Discussions in Democracy, part of the Utah Democracy Project. I'm director of the Center for the Study of Ethics and professor of philosophy at Utah Valley University, and I'm honored to be joined in the studio with three guests.
I'm Elaine Englehardt. I'm from Utah Valley University. I've been here for over 30 years, and I'm a distinguished professor of ethics, and I'm joined here by Dr. Omar Kader and Dr. Ritchie, and I'd like to tell you just a little bit about both of them. Omar Kader was born here in Provo, Utah, and he was the son of Palestinian immigrants who farmed in Utah County from 1921 right up to the 1960s. He earned a PhD from the University of Southern California in international relations and worked at Brigham Young University as a dean and in other positions for 8 years. In 1983, he accepted a position as executive director of Middle East Charity and moved his family to Washington, D.C., but then became an entrepreneur, starting his own company, and it's called Paltech. He owns this company, and it works with 5 U.S. government agencies, a primary focus on international development and technology, and his firm currently works for the Department of State, the United States Agency for International Development in Palestine and Egypt, the Department of Health and Human Services, particularly Head Start, and the Department of Labor and Department of Education. He has numerous formal working relationships, such as with the World Trade Organization and other areas to secure voting. You'll have to tell us more about that, what that's like in other countries. And quickly about Dr. Ritchie. Ritchie grew up in, well, he was born in Heber City, but grew up in the San Francisco area. And then he went to Berkeley, got his bachelor's, master's, and PhD from Berkeley, and then went to Michigan, University of Michigan. He was at University of Michigan for about 6 years, and then came on back to Brigham Young University and was here for 30 years. We've had him at Utah Valley State College as a dean, as a scholar in residence, as a faculty for the past 8 years. He has numerous books and articles. Both of them are experts in world affairs, particularly the Middle East. And that's our topic for today. David's going to start with our questions.
Why would American citizens, to be engaged citizens, be concerned with events that are happening thousands of miles away on the other side of the globe when it doesn't seem to impact our daily lives, at least on the surface?
We're a capitalist society. We're looking for markets globally. We would like to see a wide open, no barrier market that is global, and we will continue to work with countries throughout the world to drop barriers so that they can trade with us and we can trade with them. So for a country that's growing like ours, we need markets, and we're always after new markets. We would like others to think the same because we're looking for competition and we're looking for competitive arenas in which to expand all of our industries.
I think it's more crass. Oil. I don't know. Oil's getting a little expensive, I think. It cost me over $100 to fill up my van with gasoline. And what goes on every day influences that price at the pump. So that's a crass side. A more noble side is we care about people. We care about values. We care about people who are abused. We care about people who are victimized by economic, medical, political issues, exploitation, and I think we care about the world in a way that we ought to do something.
There is an issue that Dr. Ritchie raises about oil. He's right. I don't think it's as crass as it is. It's partly cunning. I mean, we have to be smart enough to make sure that our enemies don't get control of oil. So our position, especially the current administration, is we don't really care who controls oil as long as it's always for sale. And we don't even care about the price. At least our administration takes that position. As long as it's available and for sale, that's the #1 issue, because if our adversaries get control of the oil, it will cripple our economy, cripple our national security as well.
Many Americans wonder, why are we in the war in Iraq? And is it promoting democracy? Is that one of the reasons? What might be the primary reasons, but has it promoted democracy?
We're a long way from democracy in Iraq, and I don't see it for 20, 30, 40 years. We might be able to start with some basic concepts, for example, having representative government by creating a legislature and try to work at a constitution and build, but we're just beginning to see the possibility that they will end the civil war, and until that happens, we won't really see what direction it's going in, because most people in Iraq right now want security. That's all they're concerned about, is security. And the only way to get security is to consolidate power into a non-democratic state, because they don't have the democratic power right now to consolidate it, because it's too loose a federation, too loose on the laws, too loose on the defense, too loose on security and policing. We're a ways away in Iraq.
I think we're miles away from the concept, not just the time frame, but the concept of how you do it. I was in Jordan a couple of weeks ago talking with people, some Iraqi, not really refugees, but Iraqis who came to Jordan, well-educated, professional people, and they were very clear that we've got it all wrong in terms of sequence. You don't impose democracy. And you certainly don't do it with guns and bombs. Democracy has to evolve, and if it doesn't evolve within the system, it won't work. And it evolved in our country in a very long and tedious and difficult process, and it's still evolving. We still have a ways to go. And so I think it's been a tragic mistake to suggest it can be imposed. And people I talk to suggest that, as Dr. Kader says, they want security, they want stability, and they want economic opportunity. And without those, the concept of a representative democracy is a very hollow notion. They just don't respond to that. They want to be able to feed their children, to go to school, and to think that tomorrow is going to be a safe day.
Dr. Ritchie mentioned that even in our own country, democracy took a long time. It may have taken 50 years, it may have taken 100 years to the Civil War. It may still be unfolding in our own country. We may see other countries who are stronger in democracy. Can it ever happen in the Middle East? Is it possible? What are the other reasons maybe that we're there?
Well, Iraq's a little ambiguous. I think most citizens are still wondering exactly why we're there. It's not because of 9/11. We're not sure exactly, other than there are a number of theories that floated around. We need to change the Middle East and make it more democratic. We need to make sure that Islamic radicals don't spread terrorism globally. There are a number of theories that go back and forth, but when this administration started, the promotion of democracy was its #1 issue. And they went out and put every government in the Middle East on notice, we would like democracy. So we had democracy in Lebanon, and Hezbollah, pro-Iranian regime, got elected, won the majority. We asked the Palestinians to have a democratic election so we get rid of Arafat, and Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood spinoff that's very anti-American one, and I covered that election with President Carter. And I remember the morning after the election, we're all in a hotel waiting for the speaker from Hamas to come, and he took the podium, and his first statement was, "We won the election, now you have to do what we say." And President Carter had to remind him that's not democracy. Sometimes when you win is when you're weakest, because you have to compromise everything. The idea of promoting democracy abroad has finally occurred to this administration that it's not going to work the way we're doing it. So we've just gone through a 7-year experiment. We've got a lot of interesting and good data. If you have democracy in the Middle East right now, all the anti-American movements will win. Not just anti-American, violently anti-American. So the administration has backed off from promoting democracy because people have figured it out. They say that America will be pleased as long as you have an election. Fine, we'll play your democracy game, is what they're telling us. And in every case, we will end up with people who are anti-American. So we've backed off from promoting democracy, and we're going back in and trying to set up the kinds of courts and contract law, trade law, everything to do with the economy, and try to shore that up and eventually build a constituency for democracy, which we don't have in most Mideast countries. But I assure you, if you want democracy in the Middle East, it is not in America's interest to have it right now.
Well, let's push on that point a little bit more. Given the fact that some of the elections in the Middle East have not ended in the way that Americans had hoped, it raises the question. I think that those of us in the West tend to think that that democracy will grow naturally on its own out of the human condition. And do you think that it's true that given the freedom and the autonomy that human individuals will always choose a democratic form of government? Or is it possible that some people would be more comfortable in a theocracy or a socialistic state or even communism where there is more stability and security? It seems as though those of us from the West share a fundamental assumption, and the Bush administration shared it, that democracy would be the inevitable outcome of freedom. And it doesn't, things have not seemed to play out that way.
I think that's the biggest mistake about thinking about democracy, is that it's a natural way to live. It is not the most natural way to live. It's like the body. If you don't exercise, you don't stay in shape and you deteriorate. That's what a democracy is. All you have to do is look at every country in the world that whittles away at civil liberties and individual rights and human rights, and pretty soon corruption creeps into the economy, and the next thing you know, it isn't democracy anymore, it's a thugocracy, and that's exactly what you've got in most third world countries coming along.
It isn't third world, Russia.
Well, Russia, yeah, and some counties and states in the United States. Yeah. But I don't think everybody has a Thomas Jefferson inside them trying to break out. I think it's much more complicated, much more difficult, because learning to work in a democracy is a very difficult thing. You've got to learn the laws, you participate, you've got elections. I mean, all you have to do is look at the apathy in this country. Most people in America aren't living a democracy. They're on autopilot. They're not thinking about it. There are probably, 2 to 3% of the American public run this country.
Yeah, and when you look at some other examples of development, think of Singapore, think of Hong Kong, Korea in its early stages. These were not very democratic societies, and they did very well because they provided security and they provided economic opportunity and they provided stability. And that was a big deal. And a lot of people in developing countries now are saying that's a much better way to go than to have an election at the front end and have the zealots get elected. And I remember a recent discussion responding to Dr. Keller's question of a theocracy, of an individual, not an extremist, but she said, what right or what reason do we have to vote when God has already told us how to live? When we already have the rules, all we should vote on is how fast you can go on the highway. But everything else is already set up, and we ought to just implement it. And a democracy, everybody voting, is a very inefficient, counterproductive way to do that. So, yeah, I think there's some democratic dimensions that will evolve and that most people would like to see, but not a full-blown U.S. style. We're not seen as a very good role model in much of the world.
I would like to answer Dr. Keller's question this way. I think it's easier to promote free markets abroad because everyone is essentially genetic entrepreneurs. That is, genetically, they just somehow people want to trade and barter and get the economic activities going. But not everybody wants to promote freedom because not everybody believes in equality. The whole concept of capitalism is to get ahead, take care of your family. But getting ahead, developing monopolies, making sure you get to the deal before somebody else does. That's a natural process that we're seeing everybody all around the world. All you have to do is look at China, a communist country that has adopted a very loose economic system, but they're not moving on democracy at all. And so I think we're years away from promoting it, and we don't know how to do it. in America. For a country that's been practicing it or working at it for 200 years, we have not figured out how best to export democracy. What do? You have elections. Well, that's not democracy. You have to have courts. Well, you can rig the courts, and they do. We just are toying with the idea. We break it down into civil society. You go out and get your advocacy groups. You create transparency by having courts so you can arrest people. You have elections. You have executive branch, legislative branch. By the time you do those 5 or 6 or 7 categories, you have to ask yourself, where do we really start promoting democracy? And we're just at the beginning of saying, here's how to do it, because no two countries can do it the same.
Some people make a distinction between liberty and democracy. And in liberty, people are free to do what they need to do to take care of themselves, with some assumption and some guarantee that tomorrow will be a safe day and that they can go to work and earn money and take care of their family and so forth. Liberty is very different than democracy. And liberty almost always has to precede. You have to have those opportunities before you then see the logic or the rationale for political participation, representation, and fairness in some governmental process. But the liberty is a very different variable than democracy. And as I look around the world, it has to precede it, not follow it.
9/11 was a horrible event. It was a historic and most horrendous event, and maybe you can explain a little bit about that. But as I was sitting in the ballet this weekend with a good friend of mine, and I was bemoaning the war in Iraq, she was saying, no, we needed to retaliate. And I said, well, we needed to maybe go to Afghanistan and find the thugs who did this. But she had forgotten about Afghanistan and felt like that maybe it was Saddam Hussein who'd started everything. And this is a very well-educated friend. So why is it that we have 9/11 and we go to Afghanistan and suddenly then we've jumped into Iraq, and maybe some of us don't see all the clear lines, the clear highways that are driving us there?
I think that we have spent enough money investigating that connection. It doesn't exist. The intelligence community, the military, senior officers in the military know that there is no connection between Iraq and 9/11. Most of the hijackers came from Saudi Arabia, and then others came from Egypt, and who paid for it. It was a very inexpensive operation, but that is a ruse. It's not true. It's repeated regularly from Vice President Cheney on. President Bush has actually said we know there's no connection. But the public has bought into it. They've swallowed it. It's just wrong. It's not even a debatable issue. 9/11 we know is al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is in Waziristan, in a certain part of Pakistan. We're just now beginning to pressure the Pakistani government to help us go after them. We haven't been able to capture them yet. But the connection between al-Qaeda and Iraq is almost insignificant because it's a franchising terrorist operation now. Everybody can start their own cause and take off with it, and that's what's happening. They've splintered into 1,000 pieces. It's going to be very difficult. Once we catch and kill Osama bin Laden, it won't be enough. We're going to have to go out and create law and order and get rule of law in all of these countries that we're worried about. And Pakistan's our greatest worry right now. I just got back from covering that election. And the opposition won. They've had a transition. We've watched democracy work lockstep the way it's supposed to do. We had a democracy. We had a military dictator suspend democracy. We pressured him. He had his elections. He lost the election. We watched him step down. They've stepped in. Those are the kinds of things you're looking for in promoting democracy abroad. When Musharraf stepped down as a dictator, it was a great moment because we saw him let loose of prime minister, presidency, chief of staff of the army. He had all positions. Now he's just the president, and he's let the others go. Now we're going to find out how this democracy works because the people that won the election are going to impeach him probably through a democratic process because they won the majority. So we're going to create some anarchy there. Our greatest concern is a stable, nuclear Pakistan needs to be democratic to help us get al-Qaeda out of Waziristan.
When you say nuclear, you mean they've got the bomb.
They've got the bomb and they've exported the bomb. They exported it to North Korea. They did it for billions of dollars. And North Korea exported it to other countries. And just in the last 10 days, we found out that there was a possibility that North Korea was in the process of exporting it to Syria.
There's a funny kind of twist, I think, that happened here. It's very messy to go after al-Qaeda. It's very difficult. It's, you're dealing with people who are living in their own territory, in the hills, in the caves, in the mountains, and it's really hard to find them. And I heard people say, we need something that can be dramatic and straightforward, and attacking Iraq was that. We could bomb Baghdad. We didn't know who to bomb in al-Qaeda. We didn't know where to go. Where is Osama bin Laden? You can't find him. And so we wanted something simple and direct. We were absolutely wrong in the logic, but it looked like we could bomb Baghdad and be successful. And yeah, we are successful at bombing, but we're not successful at follow-up. We don't know what to do next. And so we needed an enemy, and we needed a clear victory. And that was the perception. Didn't work out quite that way, but I think that was much of the motivation, along with the weapons of mass destruction, and along with the oil, and along with all the other variables.
This business of how to go after al-Qaeda and how to fight terrorism and how to promote democracy to prevent it, we don't know what we're doing, and we're experimenting. And it's trial and error. We had the first President Bush work at it, we had President Clinton working at it, and we've got the second President Bush working at it. And we are still trying to figure out how is the best way to secure this country and defeat terrorism and promote democracy. There is an assumption that isn't widely shared that the promotion of democracy combats terrorism, and that the promotion of democracy also is possible the way we think it's possible. And it's an experiment, and right now our experiment in Iraq has been probably one of the greatest foreign policy blunders in the history of this country. And the American people have about a $2 to $3 trillion debt over it. And all you have to do is look at the military side. Just look at the generals and what they're saying about this experiment. Was it a wise thing to do? Well, history will bear out whether it was a wise thing to do. Right now it doesn't look all that good, partly because we've just run up a massive debt. 70% of the national debt now is over Iraq compared to what it was before. We're in deep trouble economically over it. Well, it's an experiment. Will it work? Well, it's not the end of America. We're a very big and a very powerful country, and we'll survive this. But these experiments of going out to democratize the world are not just floating around ideas that just say, oh, let's try this or let's try that. We don't know what we're doing, and we haven't really thought it through. And so the debate in Washington right now is, what's the best way to do what we want to do? And they've backed off from democracy promotion.
But there's another dimension of that I think is critical. Invoking systems theory. Whenever you meddle with one part of a system, you affect another part, and seldom can you anticipate the way one intervention or one activity is going to influence something else. And most decision makers in Washington are not good systems theorists. They don't understand how tinkering in one area is going to influence something else. And Dr. Kader and I both spent a lot of time in that part of the world, and it's been interesting to see the deterioration of the image of America over the years, and the recruitment on the terrorist side, on whether it's al-Qaeda or any number of other their franchise groups. I agree. And we have just given an enormous PR sort of opportunity for the anti-American movement as a result of our behavior. And I find that most people still like Americans as I go throughout the Arab world and Southeast Asia, but the contempt for American government has risen to the point of absolute obsession and contempt and rage that provides a perfect recruiting tool for the terrorists. And so our experiment didn't account for the system that would enhance the terrorists' positions.
After 9/11, I was perplexed why people would be so filled with anger and motivated by an ideology to do something like that. And during the spring of 2002, I studied Wahhabism and al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, and I arrived at the conclusion that al-Qaeda has a significant hatred of secular governments that are in Islamic holy lands, and that
Saudi Arabia.
like Saudi Arabia and like the Ba'athist regime of Iraq. And so when I began to hear the rhetoric that there was some significant and substantive connection between Iraq and al-Qaeda and 9/11, it didn't make sense to me, because I figured that al-Qaeda probably dislikes Saddam Hussein as much as America, and that Saddam Hussein would probably be unlikely to supply al-Qaeda with weapons for fear that they would be used on himself. Is that reasoning well grounded? Because if it is, the argument that it was necessary to invade Iraq because of 9/11 is relatively baseless.
When you start sorting it out, and the American public isn't supposed to know all the details about Sunnis and Shiites and al-Qaeda and whether they like Saddam or didn't like Saddam. There's a lot of details in there, and it's a little much for the average American to have to know, because the whole world is complicated. One of the things that we worried about in the Middle East is we don't want a growing Iran, and we don't want Iran to get the bomb, and we don't want them to become more powerful. And al-Qaeda doesn't want America to become more powerful. And al-Qaeda's #1 enemies are the governments of the Middle East. And that's Saudi Arabia and Egypt primarily, because two big governments, and very, very heavily supported by the United States. So they figured that the only way that they could weaken those governments was to attack us, because we're their sponsors. And so when they attacked us, we thought, well, let's see, we've got to go back after al-Qaeda and weaken it and weaken radical Islam. And somebody said, well, let's go after Saddam. Well, Saddam Hussein was our best buddy. He killed more radical Islamic clerics than anybody. And the other thing that he did for us is he kept Iran at bay. And so we knock him off, and the next thing you know is al-Qaeda rushes to Iraq and starts its main operations. And Iran rushes to Iraq and supports the Shiites. And right now, as a result of our misadventure in Iraq, Iran is more powerful in the Gulf than it's ever been, and al-Qaeda has multiple bases, and it didn't have them before. And I personally believe that our invasion of Iraq was one of the biggest foreign policy blunders this country has ever achieved, and one of the most costly. And time will tell.
Our invasion of Iraq provided a recruiting tool for al-Qaeda and strengthened al-Qaeda, which was the exact reverse of the intended result. How could that be? I remember here on this campus at Utah Valley University, Ralph Nader stood in front of 1,000 people and said that invading Iraq was like kicking a hornet's nest.
Do you remember just after 9/11, you interviewed me here?
Yes.
And on that issue, and my response was, and this got picked up by the networks, was how did I respond to 9/11? I didn't respond with rage. I responded with sorrow. But my response was, we need to look at American foreign policy. And I took more guff over that. Everybody came down on me as being a traitor because I was condemning American foreign policy. And I was arguing that our foreign policy in the Middle East and in the world had irritated a lot of people. And specifically our policies with respect to Israel, our support of Israel. And every time anybody would bring up a UN resolution that justified going after somebody, my Palestinian friends would bring up Resolution 242, which said that Israel should pull out of the land they had illegally occupied in the West Bank and Gaza. And so if we're so enthused about resolutions against Saddam, how come we're not enthused about resolutions against Israel? And so they see a duplicity in American foreign policy over the years that led to a rationalization, not a justification, but a rationalization for 9/11, for al-Qaeda attacking, or for somebody attacking. Well, before that, they were critical of American foreign policy, but in a sort of calm way. And now it became a violent way after we responded to 9/11. And you know, it's a sad commentary as American foreign policy needed to be revised, and people saw what we needed to do was strike back, was retribution. And there were much better answers than retribution.
I want to address this premise that by going into Iraq it was a hornet's nest that Ralph Nader raised. I think he's wrong. It's not a hornet's nest. It's a slippery slope. We've got a lot of bright people in government. The State Department has bright people. The CIA has bright people. Congress. Throughout our government, we have people who wrote reports, and you can get the reports. And there was a study out of the State Department that said, if you invade Iraq, we think the following things would happen, and they did. I see it as a slippery slope. As soon as we walked into Iraq, they said at the State Department report that had been written a year before we invaded, Iraq will go into civil war, and you'll probably get al-Qaeda fighting in there. That's not a surprise to everybody in the know. Everything that's happening in Iraq was predicted. It's predicted by the CIA. It was predicted by college professors all across this country who knew Iraq and its history. But there were some really smart guys in the White House who convinced the president, from the vice president and his staff to the Secretary of Defense and his staff, convinced the president that it would be a cakewalk, it would be no problem, and they were right on one count. It would be easy to defeat Iraq because it was a hollow shell of a country. It didn't have weapons of mass destruction. It had a third-rate army. It had no real capability of going beyond its borders with its threats. And so we could defeat it. And it took, what, 72 hours to knock them off. We had no plans to rebuild a democracy in Iraq. We had no plans to rebuild a democracy in Iraq. And anyone who says so is lying.
Okay.
Not to rebuild, to build.
To build or rebuild. We had no plan for a phase 4.
For rebuilding the country or building democracy. The nation building is
An afterthought.
empty.
And so I go back to you and say, it wasn't a hornet's nest. Everybody knew exactly what would happen if you knocked off the dictator, because the glue of Iraq was the dictator. And democratizing a dictatorship is a very difficult thing to do. And as soon as you take the glue out of a 3-province country, the Kurds took off in one direction, the Sunnis took off in another direction, towards Saudi Arabia, the Kurds towards, turned out that Israel stepped in to help the Kurds a lot, but the Shiites went with Iran. They had 3 different directions, and they're still in 3 directions.
We're in the midst of an election. And in this election, we're finding that the American people are saying, we're Christian, or we have Christian values of peace. We're tired of this war. We're tired of having problems in the Middle East that seem to reflect on foreign policy in other countries. That carefully over the past century, we've decided with rules, with law, when another state may attack another state. We've tried to have something along the lines of saying, we're not going to harm innocents or non-combatants. We're not going to be a first strike. We're going to get in and get out. So in Iraq, we've violated all this. So folks are saying, is this about oil? Is this about Halliburton not being able to survive if we pull out of Iraq? That they're such a huge contractor over there, employing so many, that it would be devastating. What can you say to assuage the American people about having peace and regaining our reputation?
More than those variables, I agree completely, but more than those variables is the internal sort of value system in America, the rule of law. Whose telephone can you tap? How do you treat prisoners? How do you treat people in Guantanamo? You know, the logic of waterboarding, the logic of torture, the memos that have been written. You know, we've not only had a problem in our foreign policy, we've got a severe problem in our domestic value system and what's important. What does the Constitution mean? And we're seeing that played out in many, many ways.
You know, I'm really glad to see you raise that issue, because the United States our democracy has deteriorated in very empirical terms. You have less freedoms now than you had before. There's a lot of fuzzy lines out there. As a matter of fact, we're at the point now where we're going to have some constitutional crises coming up over how far you can go to erode your personal liberties. How much snooping can the government do? And the fact that that debate is on the table means that there's an erosion of your individual liberties. There's one other item that's coming up that most of you out there watching this program won't like, and that is that throughout the world there is a movement right now to take American practices that have eroded civil liberties and individual liberties, some of the behavior of our policymakers and some of the behaviors of select few military people, have put them into the column of war criminals. And indictments in the world are coming up, throughout Europe especially, that will make it impossible for certain policymakers to travel without being served with indictments on war crimes. That came up by a scholar by the name of Philippe Sands out of Britain, and you will see more of his books and material come up. So we are going to be pulled into an international arena and held account for the behavior of some of our policymakers. It's not a very pleasant thought, but we think that our democracy is going to be put on trial, and how we've treated not just our own citizens, but citizens abroad, over Guantanamo, over Abu Ghraib, and we've already indicted some of our own soldiers. And these are very few cases of hundreds of thousands of good soldiers out there that aren't anywhere near guilty of any activity.
But back to the point that Dr. Keller raised earlier, evidence of the fact that we all don't want democracy is very poignant here in the United States, where people say they are willing to trade their freedoms for security. You know, my emphasis on security and stability and economic opportunity in the rest of the world, you know, here, many people are saying, yeah, I'm willing to trade a lot of these freedoms in order to have security. If it makes me safer, go for it.
And the sad thing about that is that there is no empirical evidence anywhere in the world and in all of history that connects security with the loss of liberties. It's like saying sucking on bananas makes you safer. It just doesn't work. The less
Are you sure?
Well, if you're watching Sesame Street, it might work. But I can tell you right now that by giving up your freedoms, you are giving up your freedoms. You are not making yourself more secure. And what you've got in this country right now is a cowboy mentality in a lot of law enforcement organizations. The FBI, for example, one of the sloppiest law enforcement organizations in America, has done a terrible job of making us more secure and has demanded that they erode our individual liberties so that they can have more snooping rights because they think they can make us more safe. Fact of the matter is, they haven't made us more safe. They've taken our individual privacy and made it more public. I think we're going to have to reverse a trend that the last 7 years has produced, and that is under the lie that if I take away your freedoms, I can make you safer. And it is a lie. It's something that communism used, and it's something that this administration has been using heavily for the last 7 years.
This erosion of civil liberties, I find incredibly disconcerting insofar as if it was al-Qaeda's goal and the 9/11 terrorists to attack our way of life and threaten our way of life, to cause us to go back on our own principles of individual rights and liberties and freedoms may be more damaging to us as a people and us as a nation than downing the Twin Towers in New York and damaging the Pentagon and downing a plane in Pennsylvania.
Well, the purpose of terrorism is manifold. One is for spectacular results and to create fear. A second is to cause the governments to repress internally and create dissent. Another one is to recruit. Brian Jenkins, about 15, 20 years ago, wrote a nice little pamphlet on why do terrorists do what they do. to get concessions, to pressure, to fear, but the most effective one is to get a government to go back and do repression and cause civil war and discontent within its own society. America was the perfect target for al-Qaeda because as soon as they hit, who became the first victims of their actions? Every immigrant in this country got rounded up, and some of the innocent immigrants are still in jail trying to get out. Arab Americans, for example, the group that I am associated with and part of, we took a beating. The first thing they did is they asked every Arab American who knew anybody that was associated with anything to do with Islamic fundamentalism to come forward and volunteer and help the FBI grow in its database. And as soon as these guys, 10,000 people went forward and they started deporting them. They started trying them. They started arresting them. And it took millions of dollars of legal fees to find out that there were none of them were involved. But 9/11 created enough erosion of democracy in this country that every one of you should be alarmed.
Another example of that, going back a ways in World War II, was the incarceration of Japanese Americans for exactly the same logic. The fear factor, the paranoia, the sort of desperate need to act, to do something. And so you rounded up my Japanese friends in San Francisco and brought them to Utah and put them in a camp. And it's that same sort of logic, that inability to really think through, to understand the nuance, to understand the subtlety, to understand the sophistication. And so you take the simple action that subtracts from freedom, that's abusive and very destructive in the long run. And we're still dealing with the Japanese American abuse during World War II.
Oh, absolutely, we are. And we're looking at the theme of democracy as we're moving through this interview. And let's go back and unpack just the simplest definition of democracy that maybe we'd give to a fundamental civics class or a group of immigrants who've come to the country. And as a second part to that, what you were saying in your last question all revolved around the Patriot Act. And the Patriot Act meant that you would give up your civil liberties, your freedoms. And so often this word patriotism has been used in one sense to combat democracy. If you ask any questions about what the administration is currently doing with foreign policy, you're not patriotic.
Yep.
If you hold any particular stances, you're not patriotic. And so has there been an attack on democracy with patriotism?
Samuel Johnson says, wasn't it Samuel Johnson that patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel?
Yeah, there's no question that a lot of the policies of this administration will be reversed in the future. Whether it's Senator McCain who wins the election or Obama or Clinton. McCain has been very forceful in the anti-torture movement. He thinks that that's just something that Americans shouldn't be anywhere near debating, let alone practicing. But the democracies have a way of self-correcting. All you have to do is look at the abuses of the 1950s and 60s of the FBI and other agencies that snooped on people and fought civil rights. I mean, that was one of the most anti-civil rights agencies in the country, and they barely transformed themselves. But we're working at transforming it, and every election tends to have the pendulum swing back and forth. I think America's a pretty wise country in the way we handle things. We get a little extreme on occasion, but I think we will reverse almost all of the Patriot Act abuses in time. It will see that the abuses are not only not the American way of life, they're very undemocratic.
One issue that seems to crop up on a regular basis and will continue to crop up is the question, is it ever right to negotiate or engage in dialogue with terrorists, or is that absolutely repugnant to a sense of justice and the political process?
Let me just give you an idea of the nuance of diplomacy here, how we do it. First thing you do is you want to label your enemy, whoever you're dealing with, in the most pejorative term that you could, whether you want to call them somebody that came out from under a rock or a terrorist or whatever. That's the kind of a game that's played. And if you can label someone terrorist, you've won about 30% of the battle. We've labeled Hamas a terrorist organization. It's very convenient for Israel to have Hamas labeled a terrorist organization. There are terrorist activities all the time. Whether they're terrorist organizations or not is another matter. But the idea of being able to negotiate with everybody, you don't always have to go and sit down across the table. We haven't gotten over the fact that in 1979, the Iranians took our embassy for 444 days and took several hundred Americans hostage, and we had to negotiate and get them out. And we haven't made up with them since. We're still angry about that. Well, it's a violation of all diplomatic protocols that have been in effect for thousands of years. You let the diplomatic types, you leave them alone. They're the messenger. But the Iranians broke that. We can get Norway, Sweden, Canada, any country in the world to represent us and go negotiate with them and say, go tell those guys they're dumb and ugly or something. You can do that kind of thing. You don't have to send the president or the Secretary of State. You can figure out ways to communicate. But America is so big and so strong and so resourceful in what it has that there is no country or combinations of countries in the world that can pose a threat to us. So we can do just about anything we want. In talking with terrorists, we can hire people to talk to them. There's a million ways to get them to stop what they're doing, but we have to engage.
And you're seeing that played out right now with Jimmy Carter.
That's why I brought it up.
In his efforts. And he says somebody's got to talk. And I agree, it shouldn't be the president. You always send somebody else. But there's innumerable ways to do this. And should we engage Hamas? Absolutely. I know a lot of Hamas people. I've had Hamas students in my classes when I've taught over there. And one of them had a basic education in the United States and said, I said, why are you part of Hamas? And she said, just to confront the assumptions that the world has about us. We need to say that Fatah was corrupt, that they weren't too supportive of Arafat and the Fatah group, and so we vote for democracy. We vote for Hamas to confront the world, to say, look, we can make decisions, we can be different, we can exercise our freedom to choose something that you don't like to prove that you're not controlling us. Yeah. And that's a very subtle and in some ways sad, but a very understandable kind of notion. And should we talk to those people? It's so obvious to me that we should. It's so obvious to me that we need dialogue, that we need interaction, and that we need to help people see a different perspective. And I applaud what Jimmy Carter does. He's not formally representing the United States, but he's a pretty representative and pretty influential person, and he does have access. And we had access with Arafat when it was illegal for the United States. And we sent all kinds of people to deal with Arafat during that time, including Dr. Kader.
Including Dr. Ritchie.
And, it's sad when you say we can't talk to people.
Well, the great frustration of this, when you talk about whether to talk to them or not, the great frustration is we've got the resources, we've got the know-how, but we don't have the guts in this country to do what needs to be done. For example, one of the basic tenets of Middle East policy is to protect Israel, but we're not doing it properly. More Israelis tell me that the biggest problem is that the United States lacks the courage to stand up and do what needs to be done in the Middle East, and we're not going to try to lead. And let me clarify that. No self-respecting Israeli prime minister can make concessions without the United States forcing them to. And they're saying, come and force us. And they're not saying, come and beat them up, come and make them insecure. There's a million ways to make Israel more powerful. There's a million ways to make them more secure. And we don't have to arm Hamas or anything else, but there's a way to go out there and make the opposition to Hamas more powerful. Instead, we've weakened Israel, we've weakened the Palestinian Authority, and we've strengthened Hamas with our policies. And we've got to go back in and do it right. And one of the right ways to do it is to be a full partner with Israel and moving towards peace, and not a full partner with Israel and saying, don't negotiate. Israel is asking the United States for permission to make peace with Syria, and the United States is saying no. Now, that doesn't make sense to anybody. And why are they saying no? Because we don't want Syria, which is allied with Iran, to be making any headway in making friends. We would like to regime change in Syria. And our policy is regime change, not talk. And that's our biggest problem right now. But the idea is you don't talk to them because you legitimize them.
You know, it
It's a
seemed,
mistake.
Yes, and you know, and it seemed like prior to the George W. Bush administration that we had a very strong focus on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and that there was a lot of discussion on these very important topics. And now we find ourselves focused on issues like torture, and people who disagree with torture being seen as radical. That instead we're supposed to say, okay, torture works, and so let's move forward with torture. So I've asked you two questions in this short time that we have left. First of all, is torture acceptable for the United States government as a policy? And what have we learned from the Arab-Israeli conflict? And can we keep progressing with it instead of worrying so much about Iraq?
Torture hasn't brought anything that we know of. People will say, oh, well, we got some information out of this guy by torturing him, and it saved another terrorist incident. I've talked with guys out of the British military and British intelligence, and they say that the most effective way was learned in World War II when we dealt with the Nazis, that not several, but dozens of Nazi generals that they took to England treated them like gentlemen, put them in very pristine situations, and it's just a matter of weeks they rolled lots of information out of them. There are a lot of studies done on it in World War II, the way the United States tried it through sleep deprivation. It was a voluntary program, but sleep deprivation, food deprivation. Food deprivation got more information out of them, but it was a form of torture as well. But we found out that you can ply them, treat them well, and get information. There's a lot of information that leads to that. There's a lot we don't know about what makes a Muslim do what they do and what would make a Muslim cooperate with us. But torture is not the realm of the way the American people behave. The Israelis have tried it, and they're in trouble in their own government right now. We've got trials going on. We've got military people confessing that they've been torturing and murdering Palestinians. The Israeli government is a country of rule of laws. They're now investigating all that. Respectable democratic governments don't even go near the practice of torture. The worst part about that is one of our own, Jay Bybee, who is a federal judge in Nevada, the famous Bybee memo. All you have to do is type in Jay Bybee or Bybee memo, and it comes up. And that's the memo that approved torture. And here we are with the Bybee memo, a BYU law grad, a Mormon, a very bright and capable guy, a respectable jurist, has his name all over the torture memo. He's not a monster, but he sure wrote a monstrous memo.
I've talked to people who have interrogated prisoners in Iraq, and they say that the pressure put on them to get information from these Iraqi prisoners led to torture strategies which resulted in information, most of which was wrong. Because when you're tortured, finally you're going to say something, and so you're going to implicate somebody who's innocent in order to make your interrogator think that you're cooperating, and so you give false information. And torture is a great way to get information, but it's often erroneous information. Sad commentary.
We had a retired Brigadier General, David Irvine, on campus, and he claimed in his research that individuals who are being tortured will fabricate the information they think they want the torturer to hear just so they can end it.
But that's been known for decades. Half a century we've known that, for more than that. You can go back to...
So you said there's smart people in Washington. Why don't they get that?
Because they're not listening to the smart people.
Oh.
And, you know, and the tough thing is, I hope that our audience listens to these smart folks here. We're down to about 1 minute, and Could we just have each of you give us a very brief closing remark? Bonner, closing remark, and then Omar?
Well, I appreciate the invitation to be part of this discussion. This is an important issue. You know, I care deeply about these issues. You know, I've lived in Israel. I've lived in Jordan and throughout the Middle East, and I care that we're seen as monsters. I care that the American government is seen as compromising on what we think is really important, and I want to change the world. I want to make a difference, and so I would love to see everybody more informed, better aware. Love to see some better decision makers in Washington and in Jerusalem and in Amman and in other places. You know, maybe we've sounded too critical of the United States. There's criticism to go around the Arab world. The Arab world has not been supportive of Palestinians. A lot of people need to change, and so I would just hope that everybody would have a little more information that they could use in making better decisions.
Well, I'm an optimist. I always think that tomorrow will be a better day than today, and I think that America is the kind of country that will self-correct all of its mistakes. The admirable thing is that we do experiment. We do make mistakes, but we correct them. And that's the nice thing about a democracy is every 2 years you have an election, whether it's for House, Congress, Senate, every 4 years for president. We can fix every mistake we're in.
David, thanks so much for inviting us to have this very good discussion about democracy with you, and thank you to Omar and Bonner.
It's been a pleasure.